Ya art nerds! So in preparation for my upcoming Making Comics and Zines class through Nashville Community Ed, I wanted to share a bit of my comic creation library. This is a resource for my students to look through so they can let me know which books they'd like to borrow so I don't have to haul all these books with me every single class. Unfortunately, I can only loan these books to students actually attending my class in the Nashville area. So this offer cannot be extended to those of you watching or those of you in Nashville who are not taking my class. I do apologize for that, but maybe this will spark your interest in books that you can check out through your local library. So these are just a few. I'm going to switch them out as we go. These are just a few of the books that I am willing to loan out to students in my class, and they can check them out one at a time. They must return the prior book before they check out the next, and I need all books back before the last class, aka our zine exchange. So I have How to Think When You Draw with Lorenzo, and this is kind of a drawing, not necessarily a drawing how-to book, although there is a lot of how-to, but more of a drawing demonstration book, sort of like what was available in the 50s and the 60s, where there's just lots of different tips and tricks for thinking about the drawing process. So this is kind of a more intellectual approach to how-to drawing books that should hopefully stick with you after you've kind of conquered the basics of drawing. So what I would recommend with this book is, this is great for people who already kind of understand the basics of construction and already understand sort of drawing from life and drawing from the imagination, but they would like to up their game. I bought this book for myself. So if you're like me, then this book is good for you. I also have Will Eisner's Comics and Sequential Art. And this is more of kind of an introduction to comics that covers all sorts of things. So think of this as kind of a self-contained comic class where he covers kind of the basic history of comics. He talks about, you know, creating the panel and organizing the page. He talks about different shot choices. He talks about panel construction and panel frames. He gives loads and loads of examples, and this is part of a series, and I have a few other books from the series as well. I'll go over them as we get to them. So this is really kind of a basic primer because it also covers basic anatomy. So I would recommend this book for someone who is just an absolute beginner in comics. And Will Eisner, for those of you who don't know, you should definitely Google him. He was the creator and the artist of The Spirit. He sort of ran a sweatshop of comics where he didn't really pay his artists very fairly and he didn't really credit them, and he kind of kept them on incredibly tight deadlines, but they produced some really beautiful art. So this is also available to borrow, and I would recommend it to people who are new to comics or old to comics and maybe didn't have access to this book. And I would believe most libraries would have this. I also have Drawing Comics, and this is a book of exercises on characters, panels, storytelling, publishing, and professional practices. And I would recommend someone who is really, really, really new to comics borrow this book. Like, I would give this book to a younger artist or to a teenager, or to someone who is just coming into comics completely new. That's not a slam to this book. It's a wonderful book, but it's definitely kind of an introduction to the basics book, which I think is fantastic. And she talks about making minis and designing as content and one-sheet minis and script writing at the back. So this I would recommend, again, maybe someone who saw me flipping through this and is like, I don't know, it looks like a little bit more than I really wanted to bite off. This is just a 6-week class through Community Ed. I would recommend this book because this is going to be a much more concise introduction. Then we have Scott McCloud's Making Comics. Many people kind of consider this the Bible for making comics. Like the Will Eisner book, this is going to be kind of a deep dive. So this is great for people who are really, really interested in learning all about comics. As you can see, it really covers a lot and the pages are really dense. I also have a copy of Making Handmade Books. This is probably something I'm going to be reviewing myself as the class progresses, because I'm familiar with a few techniques for making books, but I'd love to learn more techniques for binding. So if you want to borrow this book, you should probably ask me really, really early in the class. I also have framed ink. This is another sort of how-to exploration of making comics. I did my thesis on page composition and how that affects reading comprehension in younger readers. So I do have a lot of like books on composing shots, books on the basics of comic language, books on the basics of comic storytelling. And this book is also marked up with my notes from when I was working on my thesis. So if that sounds good to you, you can definitely borrow it in the class. I also have panel discussions, which I think it talks about multiple different artists, and it's also full of my notes, multiple different artists and how they handled comics as a medium. So they do include examples, which I like, because I don't really care for books that talk about a medium without showing what they're talking about, and this one has direct examples. It is in black and white, which I do feel for some of these pages kills the ability to read it. Never understood other than, oh, see, now there's some color. But I never understood why some art history books were in black and white. It doesn't, like, I'm sorry, oil paintings in black and white. No one wants to see that when they were originally in full color. What's also nice about this is it does like page breakdowns with explanations of the vocabulary. I also have comics sketchbooks, which is just various artist sketchbooks and sketches from various comic artists to sort of inspire students. I think I'd also purchased it to inspire myself a long time ago. So it's good because you also get a glimpse into different artist processes, and I think that kind of egalitarian makes it more accessible, makes it more egalitarian, more approachable when you can kind of see how they think rather than you're just looking at the finished piece. So this is also available to borrow. I have Working Methods by John Lowe. This book is a bit contentious now, but it includes the script, an artist bio, scripts, roughs information. There's interviews in here. There's examples in here. Example pages, examples of thumbnails and roughs, shots of the artist working. Actually, I think maybe all of the artists in here might be male. Now I'm gonna look. Yeah, well, maybe Kelsey Shannon and maybe Paquin. We'll find out in a few minutes, won't we? Character designs, scripts, thumbnailing on the script, which is a technique I really like doing. And I'm not flipping through this so that anyone can like actually learn from the book. I'm just flipping through it to show what's available in my collection. On the more inspirational front, I have Brick by Brick by Stephen McCraney. I really recommend this book if you can get a hold of it. And it's not so much a how-to as it is just how to think about yourself as an artist to avoid burnout, to avoid depression, how to change your thinking so that you can have a longer career as an artist without, completely destroying yourself from the inside. This is a really, really good book. And I believe he has a workbook for this too. I'm not a workbook kind of gal, but I really enjoyed this book and I highly recommend it. And the Drawn to Life series is also a combination of, so these are lectures given by Walt Stanchfield, who taught at Disney for decades. And not only is there art instruction, I guess I need to remove my stickies and do new stickies. Although I want to keep it because I really like the and there's also timing, like animation notes. So if you're interested in animation, this could be a good book for you. I have no experience in animation, no valuable experience in animation. And I can't even make a ball bounce, believably. So for those of you taking my class hoping I can tell you something about animation, I cannot. I can introduce you to people who can, though. But there's a lot of really good drawing, gesture, storytelling stuff in these books. And just a lot of the advice is really sort of soul-fulfilling and inspiring. So these are really, really good books. I really enjoy them. And I feel like I really need to reread them. They're great. So I have Volume 1 and Volume 2. Again, we see old Will Eisner. I have graphic storytelling and visual narrative, principles and practices from the legendary cartoonist. So this is kind of another back to basics. What is a story? Telling a story, images as narrative tools. The contract with the reader, so that's kind of the believability, the suspension of disbelief. Reader influences. And as I'm flipping through these, I'm like, I need to reread all of them. Artistic style and storytelling. And then here's a section on webcomics, which is very, very small. If you guys have questions about webcomics, I can help you. If I cannot help you, I can refer you to people who can. Inkdrop Cafe can be a phenomenal resource for those of you who are interested in learning more about webcomics specifically. It's kind of its own medium in a lot of ways, and there's a lot of considerations unique to the web. And then I have some more manga stuff, and for those of you in my class who are really into manga or really like that style, let me know. I have a lot of really beautiful art books that I can bring. I'm not going to flip through those in this video because it would be a 6-hour long video. But I did think this was a good one. I really enjoyed reading this myself. It's How to Pen and Ink, the Manga Startup Guide with Yashiro Naitao, Oh Great, and Satoshi Shiki. And this one's in English. A lot of my how to do manga stuff books are in Japanese, which is another reason why I've kind of not done a video with them, because I'd like to partner with one of my friends who's a little more fluent in the language than I am, so they can kind of explain stuff. But this has like a lot of inking techniques, a lot of like traditional inking techniques, like whoops, broke the pen. Some Q&A stuff. They talk a lot about the materials they use, which I love, because y'all know I am a material girl living in a material world. And I do, this is also all traditional media stuff. I actually don't have a lot in English on doing stuff digitally, because that is not really where my interest lies. I've written about a lot of stuff digitally over at natosoup.blogspot.com. And there are other web resources available these days for that. So the Manga Startup Guide, How to Pen and Ink, Close-Up Look into the Techniques of Yashiro Naitao, Oh Great, Satoshi Shiki. And we have Understanding Comics, The Invisible Art, another Scott McCloud book. When I started SCAD, this and Making Comics were basically like required reading before you started the program. This one is a little bit more esoteric and a little bit more of a deep dive. So if you're interested in theory, this is really good. Also talks a little bit about color process and the perception of color. But as you see, it gets a little abstract, which is cool because comics can be used as an abstract medium and often are a more abstracted medium. But for those of you who just want nuts and bolts, this is not that book. And then Directing the Story, which is a book on storyboarding and storytelling techniques for animation. But a lot of this is relevant to comics. And I took a lot of notes in here. I'm going to keep those notes though. So I own a lot of books about storyboarding and setting techniques because a lot of that is relevant to comics. I also have a lot of books on writing, like McKee's Story. and Stephen King's On Writing, and I have the one by Ursula Le Guin, which I still haven't read yet. I'm willing to loan those out, but they are pretty heavy tomes, and I don't think people could get through them in a week necessarily. So, Understanding Comics, The Invisible Art, Pen and Ink, Will Eisner, Graphic Storytelling and Visual Narrative, and Directing the Story by Francis Glebus. Surprise, surprise, I own a lot of books on drawing techniques, including Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain. And this is a book designed for non-artists. So if you are taking my class and you'd like to learn how to draw, but you really feel like it's just not going to happen, you can borrow this book. I will say, when I bought this book, I didn't consider myself an artist. Writing has always come more naturally to me, which is why I do the blog and I don't do like visual tutorials as often. And I didn't find this book helpful, but you might. We are all wired differently. Maybe I was just an artist all along and I didn't know how to reach it. But you're free to borrow this book, or you can borrow the workbook, although I would prefer that you make copies from it rather than drawing in it, since it's my copy. Or you can borrow both. I would be willing to let these go at the same time, since they do tie into each other. So it's The New Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain by Betty Edwards and The New Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain workbook by Betty Edwards. I also have The Natural Way to Draw. I did not find this to be a natural way of drawing for me. This might be a more natural way of drawing for you, though. Don't worry, I am getting to books that I love and will highly recommend. I need to read Force Character Designing from Life Drawing because I really liked Force. Let's start with this one. There's a whole series of these. I'm surprised I own 3 of them just because I thought I'd only purchased one. Force by Michael D. Matisse. Dynamic life drawing for animators. Again, this is really, okay, so any kind of life drawing stuff for animators is great for comic people too. And this is a beautiful book with beautiful, relevant illustrations. That's always kind of my thing with these other books, like The Natural Way to Draw and Drawing on the Right Side of the Brain, is they pull a lot from historical drawing, which for comic people is just not as relevant. But this is much more relevant, I think. And there's some beautiful liveliness to this. And I believe most of these were drawn literally from life. I also have Force Animal Drawing, which, again, I need to go through this, but this one talks kind of about organic, dynamic shapes. Yeah, I definitely need to go through this one for myself. My animal drawing is really stiff. This would be really good. And with these kind of books, if you have the time, what I recommend is you copy the exercises and understand why they did it, and then you find your own reference and practice what you learned on that. In fact, I'm going to kind of skip. So this is my #1 recommended drawing manual, how to draw manual, the Vilppu drawing manual. Right now, I think it's out of print and it's pretty expensive online, and I really apologize for that. But he's got a lot of videos on YouTube. If you just look up Glenn Vilppu, you can find them. This is one that if I didn't get this book back, I would definitely be hunting people down. I'd be showing up at their favorite coffee place asking them to return my book. But I love this book. I love how he walks us through it. I love how he breaks things down in various methods and kind of builds us up to like the final forms. This Andrew Loomis's Figure Drawing for All It's Worth and Paul Hudson's Constructive Figure Drawing classes are why I draw people the way I draw people. So I really, really love these books. I think they are a fantastic resource. And this seems to be a continuation on the first book with kind of like exaggerating things for character development. And this is Ben Caldwell's Action Cartooning. This is, it sort of feels like it's aimed at a younger audience, but not necessarily. It's kind of similar to the How to Think When You Draw books by Lorenzo. And there's a lot of good information in here, but it's also kind of predicated on like you already know how to draw the basics. and you don't mind pushing really cartoony. So if you want to do really cartoony stuff, like much more cartoony than how I draw, this book is probably a good choice for you. I remember when I read it, wishing that he explained his design choices a little bit more, because often design is kind of a coded language of symbols. And as somebody with ADHD, I don't always natively pick up on those symbols. So having those explanations would have been nice. I think it's also useful for people who are kind of outsiders, like maybe not from this culture, or maybe didn't grow up with this particular generation of animation, to have those things explained. But Action Cartooning, written and illustrated by Ben Caldwell, is also available. And then Will Eisner, Expressive Anatomy for Comics and Narrative. And Eisner had some gorgeous realistic anatomy. I think he did everything on a 6 and a 7 head build-up, which, like this. Let's count them, actually. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8? 7.5, really. Nice. People always felt like they had large heads, which I like. Like, my characters all have large heads. But as you can see, like, he has some gorgeous anatomy. So I think for people who are willing to really sink the time in, a combination of Vilpu and Eisner could really result in some beautiful, expressive anatomy that feels real. That was always my issue with superhero comics, is they just don't feel like people. Like, yes, they're supposed to be like gods, but even the normal people in those comics are built like gods. Whereas Eisner has like this kind of dumpy anatomy that just feels like a real person. And he's capable of drawing some really gorgeous stuff too. Like, not everybody looks just beaten down by life, although most of his characters do. But that's neat too, because there's a realism to that. So we have Will Eisner, Expressive Anatomy for Comics and Narrative, Action Cartooning, written and illustrated by Ben Caldwell, Force Character Design for Life Drawing, the Vilpu Drawing Manual, another Force book, Force Animal Drawing, Force Dynamic Life Drawing for Animators. I have a lot of anatomy books, so bear with me. I also have Bern Hogarth's Dynamic Anatomy, and I think this is a really phenomenal resource, particularly for people who want to draw muscular figures. And these illustrations are beautiful to look at. This is kind of the method that I develop faces using. Or it's the method I use to develop faces. My problem with this is it just doesn't demonstrate as much as I would like. So I would not recommend checking this out as like your first resource, because this is going to be confusing. I would recommend checking out Andrew Loomis's Figure Drawing for All It's Worth, which I have here at the bottom, or the Glenn Vilpu Drawing Manual, and then expanding with this. Move these to the side. I also have, of course, Figure Drawing for All It's Worth, which is another one of my favorite references that I talk about all the time. And you can find this online, I believe, but there's lots of good reference and resource in here. I would really recommend, because this is really written for like 1930s, 1940s, 1950s design art. So it's all ideal figures, and a lot of them are kind of posed. I would recommend combining this with the Glenn Vilpu Drawing Manual. I mean, that's what I literally do. So I guess I would recommend, and I'm going to cover this a little bit in class. We are sharing, this is a mixed class where we have people who are going to be focused on the written side of zines, and then people who are going to be focused on the art, which is why I'm recording a lot of tutorials, and I'm offering to loan these books to you guys, and I'll be available to talk online outside of class. But I will try to cover what I can, but I'm trying to be respectful of the needs of all of my students. But what I really recommend is I recommend starting by learning the proportions and the skeletal anatomy demonstrated here by Andrew Loomis. These are phenomenal, and you can find these online. You can also buy the book, and I believe the Nashville Public Library has this book. It's a really popular reference. Some colleges may also have it. UNO did not. And he also kind of explains the construction of the human form. So I would recommend kind of working your way up to like the different bodily landmarks, and then augmenting with the Glenn Vilpu Drawing Manual. And then if you really want to draw muscular people, going into dynamic anatomy. I also have Masters of Anatomy, Book 1, The Ideal Male and Female Body by Adam Hughes, Joe Madureira, Humberto Ramos, and J. Scott Campbell. And I like that it starts with like actual idealized anatomy. And I apologize, this is gonna spike the rating on my channel. But yeah, it's all nudes. It's all nudes, and it's all different ways to draw nudes. And I'm flipping through it real fast because I don't want to get flagged. But this is another book that is available to check out during my class. And since this is a class that I am only teaching to adults, unless you still live with your parents and you know they'd have a problem with it, this could be a good resource for those who really want to kind of develop their own style. We also have Facial Expressions, a visual reference for artists, and it's just a book of interesting facial expressions. Men, women, different ethnicities. This is a really cool resource. Rather than being reliant just on this, you're free to borrow it, especially if you want to like do sketchbook exercises from this. I recommend getting a small vanity mirror. You can get it from like Dollar Tree, whatever. You don't have to get an expensive one. And just Googling facial expressions too. I am going to introduce basic 1-point and 2-point anatomy in the class just so that people can kind of do their own backgrounds. But for those who really want to learn a lot more, I have these two wonderful perspective books by David Chelsea, Perspective for Comic Book Artists and Extreme Perspective for Artists. And these are not only informative, but they're really entertaining to read. I don't have a physical copy of the Andrew Loomis perspective book. It's not Fun with a Pencil. I can't remember what it's called, but it's really good. I think it's on my recommended reading list for just general comic artists, which I'll pop a link to that list in the description below. And then Watson Guptill did a really good book on anatomy that I don't know if I have anymore, but I bought it from Michael's. It's one of those thin books that, you know, you kind of assume might be full of bad advice, but it was great. It was really informative and it could explain things really easily. Oh, and this one comes with a CD that I apologize. I have never used it. Maybe I need to give it a shot. This one is definitely more extreme. That just about covers my collection of drawing books that I have available for Making Comics and Zines, part of Nashville's Community Ed class curriculum this fall. Again, if you're interested in more manga influenced art, I do have many art books on that, and I can go over some of those in another video. And I do also have books on design and typography. It's not necessarily a topic I want to dive too much into in class, but I'm willing to bring some of those for students who are interested in learning about that. And I also have a copy of the Animator's Survival Kit, which I am also willing to loan, but it's currently across the room right now, so I'm not going to go grab it. But I think that's a fairly sizable collection, a fairly sizable little resource library for our little class. Again, I'm willing to loan one book out at a time, with the exception of the drawing on the right side of the brain. I'm willing to loan out both the workbook and the actual physical book. And the way this is going to work is students can either let me know in class which book they'd like to borrow, or they can send me an email with which books they'd like to borrow. And I'm going to be keeping track of who has what, because I cannot afford to rebuy anything. And these are all from my personal collection. These are not from the National Library. However, if you would like to own some of these books, I have a recommended reading list with links to where you can purchase them that I'm going to put in the description. And I highly recommend that if you don't live in this area, or even if you do live in the Nashville area, if you want these books and the Nashville Public Library or your public library doesn't have them, take a moment and fill out a request form. Super easy. It doesn't cost you anything, and it lets the library know there's interest. And if you're interested, surely there are other people interested. It's just a statistical law that you cannot be the only unique unicorn in your area. There's bound to be someone else who wants to learn how to draw as well. So you might be doing them a favor because they might not actually know about these books and they might not realize that these resources are indeed available. And there are so many other phenomenal drawing resources available online and in print books. If you enjoy consuming for free, and who doesn't, stick around this channel. I have loads of comic drawing, painting, and inking tutorials here to help you guys out. Some of us learn better from video, so this is a great place to be. You can check out my Twitter because about once every 2 months, I do a big long list of all my favorite art YouTubers, so you can find out about new people there. You can also search for terms in the Google search bar. Once you know what you're looking for, it's easy to find a million people who can help you out. I also have a written blog. It's been going on for 10 years. It covers my entry into SCAD and my learning process in making comics, as well as loads of convention stuff over at nattosoup.blogspot.com. And you might want to begin with my Intro to Comic Craft section if you're interested in learning how to make comics. So thank you guys so much for watching. I hope this is helpful to my students and I hope it's inspiring for the rest of you. And I hope to see you guys again really soon. If you enjoyed this video, consider subscribing because I'm a comic artist and I do a lot of comic stuff here on this channel. Bye guys!